Sir, you need to move along.
Just resting, officer.
Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm really hoping to break through the magical barrier of 1,000 subscribers. That number holds a special significance for me. Hit that subscribe button. It's just one click, but for me, it's a huge boost of motivation to create my next video. Thank you in advance! In the city's central plaza, a black man with a graying beard slept beneath a patched-up blanket. Dawn had barely broken, yet 2 police officers were already upon him. They ordered him to rise. They called him a vagrant. One of them shoved him with his foot. The man slowly sat up, his face serene, his hands steady. He pulled an old cell phone from his pocket, dialed a number, and spoke with clarity. "Hello, General. They're treating me like an enemy in my own country." Seconds later, the patrol car's radio crackled, and the officer's laughter abruptly ceased. It was a gray morning, the kind where the wind cuts deeper than it warns. The plaza's ground was still damp from the night's rain. Leaves clung to benches, dogs sniffed at scraps. The city's sound was a half-awakened murmur, an impatient horn, hurried footsteps, curt voices. People rushed past, barely glancing sideways. On the corner, vendors dismantled boxes. From a kiosk, an old radio played a song far too sad for so early. Lying on a stone bench, covered by a quilt of scraps and newspapers, was Jonas. No one noticed him, or they pretended not to. Sometimes someone looked at him with pity, others with fear, but no one with understanding. He'd been there for months, a part of the plaza's invisible landscape. Birds flew overhead. A dog licked his hand. Jonas awoke slowly, adjusting his cap, folding his blanket with care, as if folding a flag. There was no haste in his gesture, no resignation, only the quiet of one who'd learned the world owes no favors to those who have already served. At the far end of the plaza, 2 uniformed men chatted by their patrol car. One pointed in Jonas's direction, the other chuckled. The air there wasn't just cold, it was judgmental. And in that institutional chill, a silent confrontation was brewing. Unbeknownst to anyone, respect was about to be tested. Jonas, 62 years old, former Army captain, decorated for service in 2 international missions, holder of a Medal of Honor and a diploma in advanced strategy, bore a deep scar on his left shoulder, a memento from an ambush on foreign soil. But there, in that plaza, he was just another man in worn clothes with a weary gaze. He slept on a bench, ate when he could, guarded his belongings with the same meticulous care as a soldier in barracks. His boots were old, military issue, still polished at the edges. His blanket was folded with precision. His backpack, always closed, contained an old Bible, a yellowed photo of his troop, and a military ID still valid, though faded by time. Jonas didn't ask for money. He offered help. He had already assisted an elderly man who fell on the sidewalk, directed a woman who missed her bus, and deterred a drunken man harassing a teenager. He was respected by others experiencing homelessness, who called him Captain. Some thought it a nickname, others an exaggeration, but he never corrected them, because Jonas didn't need to prove who he was. He simply kept being it. And this morning, his eyes alert to the plaza's movements, he knew. Something was about to disrespect not just his name, but everything he still represented. Shortly before the police approached, Jonas noticed something across the plaza. A young man was shivering, wearing a thin t-shirt, his face pale, his gaze downcast, coughing non-stop, fumbling with a trembling hand to open an inhaler. Jonas rose slowly, walked towards him with steady steps, pulled an old, well-preserved inhaler from his inner jacket pocket, knelt beside him. He said little, simply handed him the device, calmly guided him, and waited by his side until his breathing stabilized. The young man looked at him with gratitude and shame. He tried to return the inhaler. Jonas shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "Breathing is your first battle, and I've already won mine." He then returned to his bench, folded his newspaper, adjusted his backpack, and sat down again, as if nothing had happened. But something had. On the other side of the street, a child saw him. A passing young woman paused for a moment. A man feeding pigeons shifted his gaze from Jonas's hand to his face, and perhaps in that brief instant, the world saw him as he truly was, not a homeless man, but a complete man. Across the street, inside a parked car, someone watched through the slightly open window, their gaze intent, hands firm on the steering wheel. It was Morella, a social worker from the Secretariat of Human Rights. She already knew Jonas. She had tried to help him before, offering him shelter, documents, psychological support. He had politely but firmly refused, not out of pride, but because he knew he wasn't ready to be helped yet. He wanted to be heard first. This morning, Morella was conducting a survey to identify the most critical cases in the area. When she saw Jonas helping the asthmatic youth, she wasn't surprised. She simply noted his name in her notebook once more, underlined it firmly, and sighed. At that very moment, 2 police officers from the preventive patrol arrived at the plaza. They didn't approach cautiously, they came laughing. One pointed at Jonas, the other pulled out his cell phone, as if preparing to record something he found amusing. Morella felt her stomach churn. She knew what was coming, but she chose to wait. It wasn't time to intervene yet, because sometimes the best way to protect is to be present in silence. And in the plaza, respect was about to be violated. The first officer approached, hand on his hip. The younger one discreetly activated his phone's camera. Jonas was sitting, adjusting his shoelaces. He didn't even have time to stand before a light push on his shoulder. "Get up. This isn't a place for a vagrant to rest." Jonas looked up. He didn't respond. Another, stronger shove. The voice rose in volume. "Are you going to wait until we have to drag you out?" People walked by. Some stopped. Others simply averted their gaze. Morella got out of the car and started to cross the street. But then Jonas stood up slowly, with the composure of someone who once commanded entire battalions. He pulled a small, old cell phone from his pocket, pressed a number, brought it to his ear. His voice was firm, low, but absolutely clear. "General, it's Captain Jonas. I am being aggressively approached by a patrol, Central Plaza, internal code 7, silence." The patrol car's radio crackled. 1 second. 2. And then the voice on the radio sounded dry and direct. "Code 7. Confirmed. Immediate withdrawal. Confirm citizen's identity." The 2 police officers froze. Jonas extended his hand. From his backpack, he produced an old military ID, a laminated document, a living signature. One of the officers looked at it and turned pale. The other, not knowing where to hide his phone, turned off the camera. Morella approached. She said nothing, simply stood by his side. Because there, in the middle of the plaza, under increasingly numerous gazes, the street learned. Not all uniforms are visible, but all true authority carries the silence of one who needs no demonstration. The next day, the plaza dawned differently. There were fewer hurried steps, fewer automatic laughs. A patrol car was parked across the street, but the officers didn't get out. They merely observed. Jonas arrived earlier than usual. His backpack was fuller, and he also carried a folded paper in his pocket, a summons signed by the Army Command, inviting him to participate in a consultative council on public policies for veterans, an official recognition. Morella found him sitting as always. He showed her the paper, not with pride, but with caution. "I don't know if I should accept," he said. She replied without hesitation. "They didn't call you out of charity, they called you for memory and for justice." Hours later, the local newspaper published a discreet note about the incident. The video of the police officers was sent to Internal Affairs. Neither of them reappeared in the plaza in the following days. And Jonas didn't change his habits. He continued to help the young man with asthma. He continued to share food with others experiencing homelessness. He continued to fold his blanket as one folds a uniform, but now the gazes upon him were different, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Because on that plaza bench, sitting in silence, was someone who not only knew the value of his country, but was a part of its history. Jonas arrived at the Ministry of Defense building in his usual clothes. Only his boots were different. The old ones from his service days were clean, but marked by journeys off official maps. At the entrance, the security guard looked at him twice, confirmed his name, and announced him by radio. Inside, a small auditorium, new chairs, strong air conditioning, murals of soldiers in impeccable uniforms. Men and women in uniform waited. Some knew who Jonas was, others murmured among themselves. He was announced as a volunteer advisor, appointed by the Chief of Staff himself, with the function of evaluating support policies for vulnerable veterans. As he entered, he gave no speech, simply walked to the podium, placed his ID on the table, and said, "I am here to remember what was forgotten, and I will not allow what I lived through to be treated as a number." Absolute silence. The first weeks were intense. He reviewed reports, questioned contracts, proposed reforms in shelter programs, participated in visits to refugios, and handwrote a 17-page report on the reality of those who served and were later abandoned. Some were uncomfortable, others tried to discredit him, but his presence was already a response. The press rediscovered him, reports about his trajectory circulated, interviews were requested, but he refused almost all of them. He preferred his nightly visits to the plaza, where everything began each day, because for Jonas, no position was more important than the listening he still owed to those who were where he had been. And in the new power structure, he remained, as always, the most discreet, but the most necessary. The project led by Jonas began to take shape. Proposals were sent to Congress. Working groups organized visits to shelters. For the first time in years, low-income veterans appeared on the Ministry of Defense's priority agendas. But not everyone was satisfied. During a board meeting, Jonas pointed out irregularities in food supply contracts for shelter units. The numbers didn't add up. Ghost companies were receiving millions in transfers. The room went cold. A senior colonel tried to discredit the numbers, saying Jonas might not be accustomed to technical language. Jonas didn't react with anger. He simply pushed a yellow folder containing copies of documents, receipts, and photos to the center of the table. He remained silent. That night, the apartment where he was staying was raided. Nothing was stolen, but his documents were rummaged through. The folder had disappeared. He didn't call the police, he called Morella. Hours later, he returned to the plaza as if nothing had changed. Only there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't fear, but a kind of exhaustion that defies explanation. The fatigue of one who has seen many battles and knows not all are won on the correct battlefield. In the following days, rumors began to circulate. His sanity, his mental state, even his identity were questioned. They tried to delegitimize him, not directly, but with precision. Jonas retreated. He spent days in silence. Morella urged him to respond publicly. Other veterans sought him out, worried. He listened to them all but spoke little, until one Sunday he appeared on television. Sitting on a wooden bench with his old jacket over his legs, he said, "If they want to erase me, they will have to erase the history of all those who marched with me. And I still remember the name of each one." The interview went viral. Thousands of comments, letters, videos from former colleagues confirming his distinguished career. Public opinion rallied to his side, and those who had tried to silence him understood that some voices don't need to shout because they are forged from memory and respect. 3 days after the interview, something unexpected happened. General Alvaro, retired for years and now a direct advisor to the Ministry of Defense, was seen walking with slow steps through the plaza, where Jonas still spent part of his days. He arrived without an escort, without announcement, without uniform. In his hands, he carried a worn leather folder. He sat down next to Jonas. Silence. Then he opened the folder and withdrew the same documentation that had disappeared during the raid. He said only, "It never left our hands. We were just waiting for the right moment to return it." Jonas looked at him not as a subordinate, but as an equal. The general continued, "The reprisal didn't come from the institution, it came from within, and we are already taking care of that." There in the plaza, the two men who had once stood side by side on a battlefield, on another continent, sealed a new mission. The next day, the folder was officially handed over to the Inspector General's office, with formal support from the military high command. The newspapers headlined, "Army to investigate suspicious contracts following complaint by homeless veteran." And it wasn't just a headline, it was a vindication achieved not with hatred, but with truth. And for the first time in decades, Jonas was seen not as a social problem, but as part of the ethical solution for a country that had forgotten where honor truly comes from. The Parliamentary Commission concluded its report in 3 months. The investigated contracts were cancelled. 2 officers were dismissed for acts of administrative misconduct. The Military Inspector General's office issued an internal statement with a name in capital letters, Captain Jonas, 2 angels. But what moved Jonas most wasn't the public recognition, it was what happened in silence. A handwritten letter from a young soldier, delivered by a messenger from the barracks. It read, "Sir, it was because of men like you that I decided to serve. Thank you for reminding us what a uniform truly means." Then came the invitations, the solemn sessions, the medals reissued, the titles restored, but he refused the pomp. He accepted only one. At the public school where he studied as a child, the library was named after him, and on the day of the inauguration, Jonas stood there among students who had perhaps never seen a hero outside of television. He spoke little. He recounted how books had saved his mind when his body ached, how dignity resides where there is reading, and that the most valuable medal he had ever received was being called by his name. That day, A student's mother approached him with a package. It was a new blanket, and Jonas, upon receiving it, smiled in a way only someone who has lost everything knows how to do. Because in that simple, silent gesture lay the greatest recognition of all. Humanity returned, without fanfare. Months later, the bench in the plaza where Jonas used to sleep was restored. A small metal plaque was discreetly placed on its side. On it, a brief inscription: "Here rested for years, a man who always stood tall." Jonas still passed by. Sometimes he would sit at dusk, observing the new faces, the same hurried footsteps. The plaza was no longer the same. Nor was he. A child approached. He carried a small folded flag. He asked if he could sit down. Jonas nodded. The child asked if it was true that he had been a captain. Jonas replied, "I was, but more importantly, I still am." They fell silent. Then the child took a paper from his pocket. It was a drawing, a plaza, a bench, a man with stars on his shoulder. He handed it to Jonas and ran back to his mother. Jonas looked at the drawing for minutes. He kept it in his backpack, along with his Bible, the photo of his troop, and now that new blanket. And he smiled in the city that had once forgotten him. On that ground where he had once been pushed aside, he now walked with lightness, because his name had been restored, and his story finally recognized, not by status, but by truth. If this story has touched your heart, perhaps it's because you too believe that dignity is not lost with the dust, nor erased by indifference. Sometimes it slumbers, it's true, but a gesture, a look, a listening ear is enough to awaken it. Jonas didn't return to the top because, in reality, he had never left it. He simply waited with patience and honor for the world to see again what had always been in front of its eyes. And now that you know this story, may it accompany you too, because there are still many sleeping names in the plazas, waiting not for charity, but for memory. Stay with us. We still have many truths to remember together, and many stories like this one awaiting your gaze. Yeah?